Now run along.
But it's not fair. The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? I mean, if I'd been very small at birth, would you have killed me?
A queer look came over John Arable's face. All right, he said. You go back to the house and I'll bring you the runt when I come in. I'll let you raise it on a bottle like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be. When Mr. Arable returned to the house an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Put it on her chair, said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place. Her brother Avery watched as Fern came slowly down the stairs. She approached the chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid from the carton. There inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, look at him. Oh, look, Avery, he's absolutely perfect." Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's feeding bottle. She poured warm milk into the bottle, fitted the teat over the top, and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, though tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a doughnut into her hand. The children ran out to the road and climbed into the bus. Fern took no notice of the others in the bus. She just sat and stared out the window, thinking what a blissful world it was, and how lucky she was to have an entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "Its name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him and to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was away at school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze up at her with adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. Then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard specially for Wilbur under an apple tree and gave him a large box full of straw with a doorway cut into it so that he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," said her father. "You watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her, and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted, and Fern watched him as he walked sleepily back into the box. Wilbur poked the straw with his snout. In a short time, he had dug a tunnel in the straw. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight. Fern was enchanted. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road with Fern and waited with her till the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it vanished round a corner. When Fern was in school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard. But as soon as she got home, she would take him out, and Wilbur would follow her everywhere. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which simply means that he was born in springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell and would have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept, but her father was firm about it. "He's got to go, Fern," he said. "You've had your fun raising a baby pig, but Wilbur's not a baby anymore, and he's got to be sold." "Call up the Zuckerman," suggested Mrs. Arable to Fern. "Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur goes to live there, you can walk down the road and visit him as often as you like." It was soon arranged. Next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in a manure pile in the cellar of the Zuckerman's barn. The barn was very large and very old. It smelled of hay and it smelled of manure. But mostly it smelled of hay, for there was always hay in the great loft up overhead. And there was always hay being pitched down to the cows and horses and the sheep. Wilbur's new home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows. Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile is a good place to keep a young pig. Pigs need warmth, and it was warm and comfortable down there in the barn cellar on the south side. Fern came almost every day to visit him. She found an old milking stool, and she placed the milking stool in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly during the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. The sheep got to know her and trust her. So did the geese who lived with the sheep. All the animals trusted her. She was so quiet and friendly, and she grew to understand what they said to each other. Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and he did not allow her to get into the pig pen. Wilbur was happy to know she was sitting right there, right outside his pen. But he never had any fun. No walks, no rides, no swims, and often he was very bored, especially when it rained. Rain upset Wilbur's plans. He had planned to go out one day and dig a new hole in his yard. He had other plans, too. His plan for the day went something like this. Breakfast at 6:30. Skim milk, crusts, middlings, bits of donuts, wheat cakes with drops of maple syrup sticking to them, potato skins, leftover custard pudding with raisins and bits of shredded wheat. Breakfast would be finished at 7. From 7 to 8, Wilbur planned to have a talk with Templeton, the rat that lived under his trough. From 8 to 9, he planned to have a sleep outdoors in the sun. From 9 to 11, he planned to dig a hole in a trench and possibly find something good to eat buried in the dirt. From 11 to 12, he planned to stand still and watch flies on the boards, bees in the clover, and swallows in the air. 12 o'clock, lunchtime menu much as breakfast. Lunch would be over at 1. From 1 to 2, Wilbur planned to sleep. From 2 to 3, he planned to scratch itchy places by rubbing up against a fence. From 3 to 4, he planned to stand perfectly still and to think of what it was like to be alive and to wait for Fern. At 4 would come supper, menu much as lunch. Wilbur had gone to sleep thinking of these plans. He awoke at 6 and saw that it was raining, and it seemed as though he couldn't bear it. "I get everything all beautifully planned out, and it has to go and rain," he said. For a while, he stood gloomily indoors. Then he walked to the door and looked out. Drops of rain struck his face. The yard was wet and cold. His trough had an inch of water in it. Templeton was nowhere to be seen. "Are you out there, Templeton?" called Wilbur. There was no answer. Suddenly, Wilbur felt lonely and friendless. "One day's just like another," he groaned. "I'm very young, and I have no real friend here in the barn. It's going to rain all morning and all afternoon, and Fern won't come in such bad weather. Oh, honestly." And Wilbur was crying again. At 6:30, Wilbur heard the banging of a pail. Lurvy was standing outside in the rain, stirring up breakfast. "Come on, pig," said Lurvy. Wilbur did not budge. Lurvy dumped the slops, scrapped the pail, and walked away. He noticed that something was wrong with the pig. Wilbur didn't want food. He wanted love. He wanted a friend, someone who would play with him. He mentioned this to the goose, who was sitting quietly on a corner of the sheepfold. "Will you come and play with me?" he asked. "Sorry, Sonny, sorry," said the goose. "I'm sitting on my eggs. I do not play when there are eggs to hatch." Wilbur next tried one of the lambs. "Will you please play with me?" "Certainly not," said the lamb. "I am not interested in pigs. Pigs mean less than nothing to me." Sadly, Wilbur listened to the rain. Soon he saw the rat climbing down a slanting board that he used as its stairway. "Will you play with me, Templeton?" said Wilbur. "Play?" said Templeton. "I hardly know the meaning of the word." And Templeton crept stealthily along the wall and disappeared into a private tunnel that ran from the door to Wilbur's trough. Templeton was a crafty rat, and he had things pretty much his own way. The tunnel enabled him to get from the barn to his hiding place under the pig's trough without coming out into the open. He had tunnels and runaways all over Mr. Zuckerman's farm, and he could get from one place to another without being seen. Usually he slept during the daytime and was abroad only after dark. Wilbur watched him disappear into his tunnel. In a moment, he saw the rat's sharp nose poke out from underneath the trough. This was more than Wilbur could stand. On this dreary, rainy day, to see his breakfast being eaten by somebody else. He knew Templeton was getting soaked out in pouring rain, but even that didn't comfort him. Friendless, dejected, and hungry, he threw himself down on the manure and sobbed. Darkness settled over everything. Soon there were only shadows and the noises of the sheep chewing their cuds, and occasionally the rattle of a cow chain up overhead. You can imagine Wilbur's surprise when out of the darkness came a voice he had never heard before. "Do you want a friend, Wilbur?" it said. "I'll be a friend to you. I've watched you all day, and I like you."
"But I can't see you," said Wilbur, jumping to his feet. "Well, where are you, and who are you?"
"I'm right up here," said the voice. "Go to sleep. You'll see me in the morning. And tomorrow I will tell you who was talking to Wilbur from out of the darkness. Goodbye."